So what's the evidence behind ascension? How do we know this is actually happening? Well, one of my favorite quotes about this comes from Gurdjieff. That was George Ivanovich Gurdjieff. And he said the evolution of man is the evolution of his consciousness. And consciousness cannot evolve unconsciously. The evolution of man is the evolution of his will. And will cannot evolve involuntarily. So he's talking about this process of growing consciousness, learning through mistakes, basically, as we have willful early attempts to get our way. And then along the way, somehow we find out, whoops, that's not so good. Climbing one's way to the top is not good if you've clawed your way over other people. So it's definitely a process. One of my favorite ways to see that this is something that we have proof of is I really love the indigenous spiritual traditions. And so I authored a paper for the magazine called Parabola, the Journal of Myth, Tradition, and so forth. And basically, this article comes true being hoped for. It's about the Hopi. And in this article, I describe some of their creation mythologies, but interestingly enough, their creation mythology isn't just a Big Bang thing and it's over. It's a series of evolutionary stages that humans go through. And more intriguingly than that, we're only like halfway along. What they believe is that the world has already ended 3 times. They talk about a great flood. And interestingly, it really dovetails with the stories from around the world. A lot of people believe in this great flood and so on and so forth. But basically, each time the world ends, before it ends, we see signs that that's about to happen. We see life forms from previous worlds, in other words, extinct species coming back. That is actually happening. They say that we also feel like this rising of energy in our hearts and that we can see signs in the stars. They have a prophecy rock, and here's an illustration from that rock. On the lower left is the creator who's kind of holding these timelines for humanity. The upper timeline looks tempting, and people, I think, line up for it because it looks shiny and it looks all very regulated, not quite, it almost looks automated. Looks like technology is a big part of it. So that upper line shows people holding hands, but then they kind of vanish into kind of like what you might call the cloud, and then poof, they're gone. The lower line continues, and the story that they tell with this lower line is that that's the path of keeping the Kopavi, the crown chakra, open to receive intuition, to receive spiritual guidance and protection and knowledge, and to keep our hearts open to one another and to the plants and the animals, and to be guardians and safe keepers for all of our relations, whether they're with animals and plants and the earth or one another. And the big idea for this timeline is that it prophesized that there would be a decision point where humanity can choose between a sustainable future in harmonious relationship with the cosmos, or attempting it ultimately dead-end path that just fizzles away. And really, this ties in with those ending of the worlds. They know this because it's happened before many times, 3 times, and it looks like we're in it now. Well, I want to include something positive, because after showing that last slide, it may look like scary. Don't be scared by that. It just means if you're here for this workshop, then you're on the right path because you care about relationships. You're not going the path of just never mind the relations and just doing things that seem shiny. There are 8 points of agreement between physicists and Native Americans, and this comes from a group that I was fortunate to belong to while it was still operating, called Language of Spirit, and it was started by physicist David Bohm, who's the father of the holographic interpretation of quantum physics. He's a very famous physicist. Also linguists, like the author of these 8 points, that's Dan Moonhawk Alford, who I was blessed to know while he was alive, and indigenous elders, such as Leroy Little Bear, who was right there with these two, with Dan Moonhawk Alford and David Bohm when the conferences began. What the linguist noticed was that there was a language in common between physics and Native Americans, and it's very positive. It shows that everything that exists vibrates. Physicists say that, and so do the indigenous First Nations people. Number 2, everything is in flux, constantly changing. Number 3, the part enfolds the whole. This is super cool. These are all really cool to me, and I could spend a whole workshop just on these, but I'm not going to. You can look this up probably. It's kind of hard to find on the internet, but it's worth it. The part enfolding the whole is the idea of the holographic universe that David Bohm talked about. That quantum physics in some ways is bigger than the classical reality. And we see a lot of evidence to suggest that's true. There's number 4, there's an implicate order to the universe. That means it's not chaos. It actually knows what it's doing. Number 5, this ecosphere is basically friendly. Okay, that's good news too. So even when the earth is changing as we see that it is, and weather patterns are changing, it's basically friendly. It wants to work with us. And these are from people who've seen the world end a few times. I want to remind people so that they're not just talking cluelessly. This is from deep wisdom. Number 6, nature can be taught new tricks. So that means humans often cooperate with nature. Sometimes we do find things that help us to relate better to nature, but it really needs to come from our hearts to stay in that correct place of respect. Number 7, quantum potential is similar to spirit. And I'd add to that it's really all about consciousness. That's who we really are. Number 8, there's a principle of complementarity akin to fourfold logic. And that means that we don't need to see things in black and white, but we need to be more embracing of things being true and false, not true and not false. And that's how nature really operates. Okay, so what else can we say about ascension and what's showing us that it's there? Well, here's the wisdom from a philosopher, Bernardo Kastrup. He talks about mental states are real. He says physical quantities describe merely our perceptions and are therefore relative to each of us as observers. What is really out there underlying our perceptions is constituted not by physical, but by transpersonal mental states instead. Perceived physicality is merely a representation of that surrounding mental environment brought into being by an active observation. And we're going to come back to this again and again. It's really the active observation is so pivotal. And if you've ever noticed that you can change how you observe things by changing your mood or the way you're looking at something, then you know just how powerful that can be. But in this case, Bernardo, he means that it really does literally change reality. Here's a cartoon by Charles Schulz from Peanuts with Charlie Brown talking to Linus. And Linus is saying, so if I'm aware that I am aware, then that is not awareness, in that there is a division between the observer and the observed. Okay, well, that's kind of funny. So this is really getting to that idea that I'm mentioning throughout this whole workshop, that how we interpret our perceptions matters. So if we're the one observing, then maybe who are we in these layers and layers and layers of observation? And what I'd like to look at is what if levels of observation, that's like levels within your social groups, levels within each of us, are at the very root of consciousness itself. And I would say that we've observed this, like when you perceive something. Here's a picture of a butterfly landing on a person's nose, and that person is smiling. So obviously they didn't go into fight or flight, like, uh-oh, it wasn't a scary situation, it was one of joy. But that was a process of interpretation, because when something lands on your nose, it's right close to you. So you need to perceive something and then interpret your perceptions, and then recognize this is you, that's your nose, and proceed accordingly. So it's really a process as you expand, as you ascend, of integrating this awareness of levels of self. Where does this idea come from? It comes from one of the two inventors of calculus, who, of course it would, because he's looking at levels of things. If you know calculus, you know that's what it's doing too. So Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz lived between 1646 and 1716. And he viewed consciousness as requiring both a first order perception of X, like the butterfly on the nose, and a second order reflective perception of the original perception of X. And one of the quotes from his book, Principles of Nature and Grace, said, "It is good to make a distinction between perception, which is the internal state of what he called a monad, representing external things, and apperception, which is conscience, or the reflective cognition of this internal state, which is not given to all souls or at all times to the same soul." So it really means there's all this interpretation going on. And that is how we form our sense of self, as well as our sense of what's inside of us and what's outside of us. One more thing about Leibniz before moving on. He had this brilliant observation that conscious perception arises gradually by degrees from perceptions that are too minute to be noticed, such as unconscious perceptions. So unconsciously, you might notice, did something just move? Or was that a reality shift? Or is that number on the clock what I think it is? Or so on and so forth. Sometimes these are just like delicate little observations dancing on the periphery of your awareness, but then they can zoom in and become full focus, what you're really looking at, like, okay, what's going on here? Awareness itself flows through levels. And one of my favorite researchers in this area is Tony Bell. That's me standing with him at UC Berkeley. He says biological order comes from information flows that move up and down levels via emergence and submergence. There is no such thing as noise. These are huge positive ideas for us because it's showing that within biological systems like our own bodies, there are these mesoscopic junctions. We think of neurons and the neuron gaps and so forth, and they operate between different levels. And there's some kind of level switching going on that exists in all living matter. So it's there. It's allowing us to, of course, to communicate with our own selves. If we touch a hot stove, we know that we touch something hot. Butterfly landing on the nose, we can sort that out and so forth. We take these things for granted, but I want to draw attention to it because these levels of consciousness are much bigger than just what's in our body. And then another scientist that I've interviewed on my podcast, Living the Quantum Dream, and I've been a big fan of his for 20 years. He's now becoming more noticeable in lots of circles. This is Donald Hoffman, and he is a visual expert, and he describes contents of perception as being similar to icons on a computer desktop. And that's the picture here on this slide, where you might be familiar with where your trash is. You can throw things away on your computer, like done with that folder, throw it in the trash. But those are just icons. That's symbolic representation of what the computer's doing. Inside the machine, it's got read-only memory, random access memory. It's got bits and bytes. It's got all kinds of machine language and so forth. So it's interpreting that. And that's what all of our body is doing as well. Okay, and then one more thing about the proof and evidence of this ascension, what's going on here. Once again, I'm quoting Bernardo Kastrup. He says in Scientific American a couple of years ago, one of the weirdest implications of quantum mechanics is that different observers can give different equally valid accounts of the same events. As highlighted by Carlo Rovelli in his Relational Quantum Mechanics, this means there should be no absolute observer-independent physical quantities. All physical quantities, the whole physical universe, must be relative to the observer. The notion that we all share the same physical environment must therefore be an illusion. What he's referencing are some experiments that were published in 2019. And of course, Carlo Rovelli was right there with his relational quantum mechanics theory, which I am also a big proponent of and fan of. And I've also co-authored a physics paper on something very similar, which is all about subjective reality. That was a paper I co-authored with George Weissman, and my papers are available on my website, so you can go there and find them. Carlo Rovelli, he also talks about the same thing, that each of us has basically a subjective reality. And the fact that we tend to agree on things is interesting. And it's almost surprising in some ways that we do agree on so much, because there is such an individual aspect to the way that we each interpret and observe. And the experiment that happened and was published in 2019 was one of these double slit experiments with 6 entangled photons, where it was basically a variation on the Wigner's friend experiment, which that just means there's an observer and then there's someone observing the observer who's looking at the double slits. And they used mechanical devices in this experimental apparatus in a collaborative experiment conducted between University of Vienna, Austria, and University of Edinburgh, Scotland. And what they found, shocking to many people, was that 2 devices at the same place and same time absolutely observed 2 different things. And these are trusted devices. this blew things apart in a big way for people that believed that there is such a thing as objective reality, because maybe there isn't. And here's a cartoon of two inmates in a jail cell, one of them painting what's outside the bars, one of them painting the bars. And I think we've all seen that. We've been side by side with someone and they're just seeing the world so differently. So this is very much how things actually work. Okay, so let's move into why does it seem so dark? This is really something that we're all going through right now, that we're going through this interesting time of worldwide international lockdowns and all kinds of regulations and these draconian measures, some say no, it's for our own good. We need to stay inside. We should socially distance. We need to, so on and so forth. But to a lot of us, it can seem dark. I think most of us, at times, it seems dark. So changes in focus of attention, values, and priorities in the ascension process are often accompanied with awareness of changes in relationships. So if we're asking for the deeper why, like why is this happening from an ascension point of view, it's time to reassess our relationships. So we need to do that in ways. I'll move to the next slide. This is funny. I think we can relate to this. There's an elderly lady sort of lifting her eyeglasses to adjust to see what's on her computer screen. And it says, reading through my soul contract, wondering WTF I must have been thinking when I signed it. Okay, some of us may have been there this year, just like, okay, what the heck is going on? Well, like I said, it's look at the relationships. That's where we can start to get the clues. We can also look at the pain point of ascension. And here, if you look at the vision of a positive path to a possible wonderful future, which I would believe in, I'm an optimist, I totally believe in it. So through ascension, we can become aware that collectively we're supporting one another through relationships on this journey. Thanks to a series of crises, humanity, apparently we're only 50,000 years old as a species, whereas whales are millions of years old. We can now experience an individual and collective awakening from self-centered, egoic, or what you might call 3D consciousness, to a whole-centered, cosmic, divine-centered, Buddha-centered, Christ-centered, God-centered consciousness. So we're moving more, it's an expansion, moving out of that little me, egoic, selfish interest to something bigger. Barbara Marx Hubbard, she had a book called This Crisis is a Birth, and she's had a vision that was powerful for her. She saw that given the vast speed up of connections and the communication systems and the fact we're constantly impinged upon by awareness, that we're connected mainly in a painful way through war, hunger, environment. Is it possible that crisis itself is a trigger of a consciousness? And if enough of us choose to, I think it's part of the human intentionality here. If we would choose collectively to shift that consciousness, even by intention, I believe we could have an extraordinary effect on the collective consciousness. And that's a big idea. I really agree. Crisis is a birth. This stress, this whole, all the things that may seem so challenging to us now can help us pull together when we pay attention to the relationships. So why does it seem so dark? Well, I love this picture. It's a gentleman just looking at the camera. If you get what you want, it's divine direction. If you don't get what you want, it's divine protection. This is a great thought to have in mind. And it helps to have faith. This is illustration of a spiritual awakening. It shows two giant hands. One, and there's a little tiny person in the middle that says me, and the big hand, the left hand of God, looks like it's about to flick the little me into the air off of a precipice, off of a cliff, into nowhere. Except the good news is, apparently God's other hand is poised to catch. So it does help to have faith. We can gain strength and inspiration in adversity. We can trust the ascension process. That some relationships are transformed at work, home, and with money and prosperity and love. And here we see little birds, I guess, taking their first leap out of the nest to try to fly. Their wings look ridiculously small. I don't know if they're going to actually fly on this journey, but they're trying. And that's what it can feel like to us too. And here's a picture of a dog looking bored next to two humans on their cell phones at a sort of an outdoor dining table. And the caption says, when the conversation is not about deep spiritual stuff. So some relationships and jobs may naturally come to transition points, and that's okay. You might get to the point where you don't really want to be with the people and have the conversations that are happening there. You've outgrown that.